This story of Jesus's transfiguration is a story that comes around every year in our worship cycle because it's in 3 of our Gospels, because it's a feast day, because it's a highly dramatic and celebratory text. Yet I think most of us, myself included, don't quite know what to make of this strange story that stretches our understanding of time and space, of heaven and earth, of human and divine. In my experience, there are 2 major streams of teaching and interpretation around this story. The first is what I'll call the theological symbolism approach. From the moment we hear this text, we know we're in this literary layered story with allusions and symbols carrying great meaning. We've got Jesus transfigured, whatever that means, changed in appearance, transformed into something beautiful and elevated, just as the book of Daniel prophesied would happen to the Son of Man. Just as Moses' face turned bright and shining, such that he had to cover it with a veil when he came down from receiving the law on Mount Sinai. So it's a taste of Jesus's glorification, a taste of Jesus's status as Messiah and fulfiller of the law, a taste of and foreshadowing of his resurrection. But there's more. Then Elijah appears representing the line of prophets, and Moses representing the law, as if to show that in Jesus, the law and the prophets are coming into fulfillment, and that Jesus is endorsed by the greatest of the greats in Hebrew religious history. And then on top of all that is the voice from above reaffirming what God spoke at Jesus' baptism. This is my son, the beloved, listen to him. It all amounts to a rich biblical and theological affirmation of Jesus and his role as Son of God and Messiah of all humankind. But what does all that theological layering mean for us reading today? Don't we already get that Messiah stuff from everything else Jesus did? And we already heard God say, "This is my son, the beloved," in the baptism story. So what new thing do we learn from this weird account of Jesus shining? These questions are perhaps why the second interpretation focuses much more on the human side of the story. Peter, James, and John, the story goes, had an incredible experience on top of that mountain. They saw their rabbi and Lord in true, transfigured, divine beauty, and they saw their childhood idols, the great Moses and Elijah. Peter wanted to build a house and stay up there forever. But all mountaintop experiences like this one must come to an end. And Jesus was calling the disciples back down the mountain and to continue their ministry in the real world. I've usually heard this interpretation at the end of a hype-up week of summer camp or a retreat. It was time to leave the spiritual high of the retreat and go back down the mountain. But even this experiential interpretation has limited relevance in our lives. It only applies at that fleeting moment when you're on the mountaintop. What if you don't regularly have such mountaintop experiences? What if you haven't had one for a while? It's all well and good to hear that you're supposed to go down the mountain and back to ministry among the hurting people in the real world. But if you already feel like you're down in the valleys working hard, giving everything you have to your church and your community, to your teachers and your parents, to your kids and your friends and your work, then what do you have to learn from Peter, James, and John? So I've been thinking more about these 3 disciples, wondering what it really was like for Peter, James, and John to be there, where they've come from, where they're going on this day of mountain climbing. How much of their experience really was so wonderful and inspiring. After all, this mountaintop experience is the middle of a story, a longer story. What was it like for them when they were right there in the middle, before they had the perspective of the end? Maybe I'm asking this because it feels to me like we're all in a confusing middle of a story right now, right along with them. We're in the middle of a pandemic, certainly, or the middle of a vaccine waiting list where the end is not quite so near as we would like. Or we're in the middle of a frustrating, de-energizing, sometimes disappointing school year, whether as a student or a parent or a teacher. The middle of a process of reorientation the past year has brought us, whether reorienting our friendships and marriages, our griefs and blessings, our physical and mental health, our vocations and finances, even our entire political landscape. Or maybe, like Peter, James, and John, we're in a kind of middle with regards to our journey of following Jesus, in which we feel joy and purpose and gratitude one moment, and bewilderment or uncertainty the next. I guess we're all in the middle of some confusing story right now, and we don't have the benefit of hindsight to draw out the symbolic significance of the days we're living. But so it was for Peter, James, and John. When Jesus invited them to go up the mountain with him that day, they too were in the midst of a confusing time. Following Jesus had started off exhilarating, but lately they'd gotten strong opposition from religious leaders. And just a few days ago, just when Peter had thought he was catching on that Jesus was the Messiah, Jesus had given him a strong personal rebuke and taken the air out of his sails. Jesus had tried to reorient the disciples' understanding of the Messiah. The Messiah would suffer, Jesus said, and be rejected and die. And all who followed him would themselves, too, be on a path of potential suffering, cross-bearing. So it had been a weird week. And now here they were on an exclusive hike with Jesus, climbing up a mountain. So maybe they could get some of their questions answered. Instead, it seems they were in for more bewilderment. When they reached the top of the mountain all alone, Jesus turned dazzling, brilliant, shining, just like the descriptions of the Ancient One, the Son of Man in the old scriptures. Or was he like Moses, whose face had shone when he came down from the mountain? And speaking of Moses, could that be the great leader himself? And wait, this had to be impossible, but was that Elijah, the great prophet? It all happened so quickly there was no time to ask questions or use one's rational mind. Peter and the others, Mark tells us, did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Peter suggested they hang around and build some dwellings, but was that out of joy or wonder, or was he just trying to figure out what one does and says in such an unprecedented situation? I mean, it was exhilarating seeing Jesus like that, to be sure, but there was also a haziness, a weight to the whole thing that was frightening. And meanwhile, you don't have long to ponder that, because soon a cloud came down and overshadowed them, and they heard a voice saying, "This is my son, the beloved." And then the cloud lifted, and they were left with Jesus again. I don't know about you, but I think it would almost be enough to make you wonder if you'd imagined the whole thing. Would certainly leave your head spinning. So on the way down the mountain, rather than interpret this experience for them, Jesus seemed to throw more fuel on the fire, telling them to keep quiet about this whole thing and to remember it later on after his death. In other words, I have to think that for Peter and James and John, this experience, while beautiful, exciting, would also leave you feeling uncertain, perplexed, like you were in the middle of something and you didn't know what was next. And indeed, after this mountain, Peter and James and John go back to the slow, unstoppable march towards Jerusalem and towards the cross. There's no evidence of any great transformation for them from this experience. They still argue over which of them is the greatest. They flee when Jesus is arrested. Like any spiritual experience in the middle of a larger story, it's hard to hold on to the significance of that dazzling moment. So part of me wonders why Jesus brought them anyway, or at least why did he bring them back down so quickly before they had a chance to understand? Is this what spiritual revelation is always like in this world? Do we ever only catch a glimpse of God for an instant that we can't fully grasp or understand? And is the glimpse of God's glory in our lives always sandwiched so nonchalantly between the usual mishmash of frustrating and joyful, mundane and meaningful events of our lives? Well, maybe. This passage got me wondering about mountaintop experiences in other parts of the Bible, other epiphanies and revelations. So I looked at some examples. Hagar, meeting the angel of the Lord and experiencing the blessing of God in the wilderness. Jacob, receiving a blessing from God on his long journey home. Moses, seeing God's glory on that mountain. Elijah, hearing the voice of God in a gentle whisper. For the most part, these glimpses of God's presence and glory happened in the midst of a long life's journey, a larger story. They were preceded and followed by struggle. They were mountains in the middle. Hagar, who was the slave of Abraham and Sarah, was running away from enslavement and ill treatment with her baby in the wilderness when she met the angel of the Lord, received God's blessing, and became the only person in Scripture to give God a new name. And then she went back to captivity. Jacob was on his way home after a long exile, scared to face his estranged brother, and it was after a night of literally wrestling with God that he received a blessing and proclaimed, "I have seen God face to face." And then after that, he settled and lived through many more years of family heartache and famine. Moses was lamenting the Israelites' golden calf incident of idolatry. Moses was battling his own tendency to anger when God called him up to Mount Sinai and allowed him to see God. And after that, Moses spent many more years in the wilderness. And Elijah was fleeing for his life and despairing in the desert when God called him up to Mount Horeb and revealed God's self to him in the sound of a whisper. And then, after that, Elijah went back to prophesying in a hostile land. Most Bible characters who saw God in some sense saw God in the middle of a normal human story of struggle and joy. And isn't that so lifelike? The glimpses we get of God are often the least expected moment. They don't always change the course of our lives. They don't always make sense at the time. We don't always know how to interpret them or integrate them. Even for the greatest among us. Letters and conversations published after her death revealed that Mother Teresa, for the last 50 years of her life, struggled to sense God's presence. There was only a brief period in the middle of that time where she re-experienced the joy and hope of Jesus that she'd felt early in her ministry. And then it seemed to disappear again. And yet she continued to serve and be faithful to the God she knew she was called to love, even when she couldn't feel God's dazzling presence. So is all of this a bleak message, to think that even great saints, great disciples, great heroes of the Bible may have only caught a glimpse of God's glory for a moment in the middle of a longer struggle? You could see it that way, I suppose, but I think it's a message of hope. Because it means that if you find yourself in the middle of a story, a confusing middle, a tiring middle, a shadowed middle, you're in good company. Often this is part of the life of discipleship. And because it means that often, though not in any kind of predictable timeline, but often to those who continue to walk faithfully, to those who wrestle with God like Jacob, or cry out to God in lament like Hagar or Elijah, or keep following in the footsteps of Jesus even when they don't fully understand, like Peter and James and John, there may come moments of God's dazzling presence and beauty. We don't know when they will come or how long they will last. An inner sense of peace, a sudden clarity of direction and where God might be calling, a deep feeling of being loved and held even in life's valleys. But in a way, it's good news to know that these experiences really aren't based on our getting everything right. Jacob and Hagar and Peter certainly didn't. Nor are these experiences reserved for those on some trajectory of spiritual achievement, some high rung of faith. God's dazzling, confusing, but beautiful presence, God's deep love, can become known to us right in the middle, right in the thick of it. And what we can learn from Peter, James, and John is that our role is simply to keep being faithful, to keep following Jesus, to keep hanging on in the ups and downs of the life God calls us to, and then maybe just maybe, right in the middle of a life of questioning Jesus's hard teachings, right in the middle of doing work of healing and justice, right in the middle of squabbling with our neighbors and fellow disciples, right in the middle of rethinking our previous understandings of who God is, God might give us a glimpse of beauty and belovedness so bright that it can continue to burn in our minds, even if we don't fully understand it. And it can continue to give us hope in our journey from the middle and onward.